afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Focal Point's RPA and the Path to Digitalization webinar, What's in it for Internal Audit. We welcome you and wanted to spend the next hour with you sharing some insights about RPA, digitalization, and internal audit. My name is Larry Burke. I'm a principal and partner with Focal Point Data Risk, and I am part of our risk consulting group. Along with me on our panel are Dave Graff, Eduardo Diquez, and Rene Herrera. Dave, would you give a few words about yourself?
Sure. Thanks a lot, Larry. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dave Graff. I'm a vice president here within Focal Point, and I have responsibility for the integrated risk management service line, which includes GRC, ERM, and also RPA, which we're going to be talking to you guys about today. So, Eduardo, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Dave, and welcome everybody. Thanks for coming, and a big thanks to Focal Point for inviting me to be part of this panel. I work for Auxis, management consulting firm and outsourcing firm. I lead the intelligent automation practice and have been working with RPA for 5 years now. So we also, I think we're going to be joined by Rene Herrera today. Could you please do a brief intro?
Sure, definitely. Thanks, Eduardo, and thanks, Larry and Dave, for having me today. My name is Rene Herrera. I work for Office Depot. I'm the IT audit director, and among my responsibilities, I manage innovation within internal audit, and that includes data analytics, GRC, and automation. So pleasure to be with all of you this morning. Back to you, Larry.
Thank you, Rene. And as you can see, I think we've got a very good panel here representing both RPA, internal audit, and then Focal Point to share with everybody what we're seeing in the industry. So as we jump into what we're talking about today, I think we all need to start with the frame around digitalization and what is a firm's digitalization strategy. And when we think about digitalization and why it's important, we wanted to just make sure that as we talk about this type of initiative, RPA and digitalization and data, we understand that this is really part of a larger initiative run by the enterprise. It is typically not an internal audit function or an IT function. It should be part of a global strategy by your enterprise to move into digitalization. And so why do we think digitalization is important? Well, we know from McKinsey that companies with the greatest overall growth in revenue and earnings receive a significant proportion of that boost from data and analytics. And we're seeing today the shift as companies continue to migrate from becoming a product firm to becoming more of a service firm. And with service comes data, and I'll point to a couple of examples. But if we look at what Gartner is telling us, 91% of organizations today are engaged in some sort of digital initiative. And the reason for that is because a lot of organizations today are shifting their business models. I want to just highlight two, and this is just hot off of the press. If you saw, I think it was last week, Ford's new CEO was talking about how instead of selling trucks, they're going to sell trucks, but what the customers really want are the data feeds from the trucks to help support the decision-making that the users of the trucks need. So you're seeing Ford going from a truck company to now being a truck and data company. And so things like fuel usage, things like running time that can now be monitored because of that data is part of Ford's evolution to become more of a data company. Another example, and this again, I read this today, where GM is going back into the insurance business. And General Motors sells a lot of cars, product company, but now they're going to use that information from the cars through their OnStar system to get better pricing for insurance. So all of that data is being created, and we now know and see that if you look at the chart here, the amount of data being replicated, created, and captured per IDC is exponentially growing. It's really how people work, and the most successful companies have intelligently integrated data into everyone's daily workflow. And when they start to integrate things into the daily workflow, that begs the question, what kind of tools, what kind of avenues companies have to take that data and process that data appropriately? So as we talk about RPA is a tool that a lot of organizations are adopting to go ahead and process that data, analyze that data. And that's something, Renee, that you've had a lot, or I'm sorry, Eduardo, you've had a lot of experience with. Can you share with us a couple of thoughts about what you're seeing from RPA? What does it do? What does it mean in this new data-driven digital world?
Yes, I think that, as everybody is going down the digitalization of their processes, RPA is one of the major tools that all organizations are using these days. And it's pretty much a thin layer of software that sits over your existing software and applications to mimic what person's actions are happening in all these applications. So it's a really quick to implement solution that can basically do the same thing as a person is doing today. You give it username and password like any other user that you have today in your operation, and you basically are able to replicate that. So implementations of automations of processes do not take months, but weeks, which makes it extremely interesting for organizations to go down the path of automation without doing a major systems change or integration on the back end of their databases.
And Eduardo, as you see that, I know that a lot of companies are moving towards real time, trying to get data, analyze it, and in almost real time facets, report on it so they can action that information. In the old days, and I say old days, but we're talking today or a few years ago, a lot of companies would take that data manually, have somebody human touch it, process it. There's time that it takes to do that. I know we're seeing the substitution of RPA for humans doing those tasks.
I agree. And a lot of, that said, there's a lot of applications out there that you can schedule data feeds that lead to databases that can feed on real life data. But there is a significant number of applications that do not let you do that. So you have actual people going in, logging in, extracting the data, manipulating the data in some way, and then sharing that. And I think that 40% of the bots that I've ever built are really involved in that space. You're able to extract information from different systems. You don't know how many companies out there have several ERPs and how to report on them accurately from different sources of data. And RPA is a great tool to being able to achieve that several times a day to make it as real time as possible in a lot of cases.
Thank you. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the benefits from RPA. And as we talk about RPA, if we put on our control hat, we think about manual controls and automated controls. And we know just inherently there's more risk with manual controls versus automated controls. There's more dependency or more likelihood for error on manual controls versus automated controls with a couple of caveats. And so one of the things that we're saying is that from a governance perspective, we always advise our clients, to the extent you can have an automated control in place of a manual control, go in that direction. It'll improve your Sarbanes-Oxley compliance efforts. It should improve your overall control environment. And so we talk about some of those benefits. Can you articulate some of the other errors or savings that reduction in errors, some of the things that you've seen as you've implemented RPA and how that's improved the internal control environment, Eduardo?
Yes. So even though I would say 90% of organizations go down the path of robotics with the purpose of reducing cost, increasing productivity, and going down the path of adding additional capacity to their existing organization, making transactional processing a lot more scalable for seasonal activities and for ramp up in specific scenarios. Let's think about construction and how they ramp up transactions when they get into a new project, and then they ramp down when those are completed. It's absolutely true that one of the reasons why a lot of organizations also do this is to try to automate a lot of the manual controls that are happening in organizations. As an example, I think that I've mentioned that we're in outsourcing. We actually process finance and accounting, customer service, and supply chain, HR for a lot of organizations, US based, from our center in Costa Rica. And there's naturally a lot of controls that are happening manually. With RPA, we've been able to automate a lot of those controls that were supposed to be covered by supervisors or managers, and has really improved our service levels to our customers by reducing errors and reducing mistakes, increasing the speed and of transactions, making data available faster. but also reducing the inherent cost of having to audit these processes because they're automated now. So it's definitely something that as companies mature, but needs to be thought from the beginning of RPA is one of the key benefits that we have seen on reducing that risk.
And I think one of the things that, we've thrown around in the executive suite, they're always looking for ways to save dollars or maybe redeploy the dollars to go from, compilation, if you think in the accounting world, compiling to analyzing. Can you talk a little bit about what some of the ROI and some of the cost benefits that you've seen through that process?
As I mentioned before, because this is the development for processes is really quick. So imagine like building a recorder macro in a way, but across any application. We actually have seen that organizations can actually receive paybacks within a year. We're looking, if your main source of or main reason why you want to do RPA is cost savings, you can receive really good paybacks even for processes that only have half an FTE assigned to them. So it's something that is really transformational, and this is why there's such hype around it, because this can really bring help on almost every area, every industry. It used to be really catered to banking only because of the nature of the business, but now this is going to almost every single other industry out there.
So we're saying increased enterprise value, faster decision making because management now has that information faster. There's always the concern about the integrity of that information, and so that's a good way to talk about digital transformation. And we've heard about folks going from RPA to AI to machine learning. If you go and look out on the web, you can see RPA does everything but sliced bread for you. And so one of the things that there seems to be an acronym soup around what RPA is, what AI is, what it isn't. Can you, Eduardo, share with us a little bit about, outside of kind of the sizzle, what really you're seeing with RPA and kind of how that life cycle evolves to what I'd describe as more advanced decision and judgment making to help management?
Yeah, and I think it's even though a lot of people are thinking right now and have been thinking for the past 4 years how to really implement artificial intelligence, it's something that only about 1% of organizations have actually been able to do, outside of just using very specific use cases, which I'm going to lay out in a second. But most organizations begin on the RPA side of the house, right? They start to automate their transactional processing, rules-based, and having people outside of those processes really manage the more complex exceptions and scenarios, while bringing significant value to the organization. Naturally, the next step on that is to focus on how do I bring predictive analysis, predictive analytics, and decision-making support by using artificial intelligence. As of today, it's been cost prohibitive to actually go down that path for most companies, because you need dedicated data scientists to identify and understand the data, the use cases, and really provide useful use cases. So most organizations have been using this technology for data extraction, for natural language processing, and you're using services such as Microsoft Cognitive or Amazon Web Services to really get that information, and Google services. So really having the right platform in place that will enable you to consume those services. No one platform is going to be able to give you all of that in best class. So you need to at least have the right RPA technology in the center that will connect to all the different technologies to be able to achieve that. So you have companies like the one we're partnered with UiPath, that you actually just with APIs seamlessly connect to all these services, depending on which one you're choosing, to be able to do that. So what we have seen now is that a lot of organizations using it for image data extraction, for text like sentiment analysis, and for voice analysis. But the whole AI, I'm going to give you a decision, it's something that now in 2021 we're going to see a big growth, because organizations like UiPath has made it really have democratized that by having drag and drop machine learning models that are cost effective and you can actually build a business case around without having to have, to reduce your headcount by 50 people. And
yeah, it certainly sounds like a journey. And I think that dovetails into our next question here, our polling question. For those that are looking for CPE, there's an opportunity for folks to go ahead and answer a CPE question and get an hour of CPE. So let's give it a minute while everyone goes ahead and populates their poll question. And then I think as we get into, we understand and recognize that RPA is a journey an enterprise undertakes. Where does internal audit come in? And I think what we'd like to do now is bring in Dave and Renee, and let's talk about internal audit and what its role is and how it can provide different levels of value and expertise throughout this journey, which we think is so important. Dave?
Absolutely. Thank you, Larry. What are some things? How does internal audit play in this RPA thing that's happening out there, in the world? This is new for us, right? I mean, we've heard RPA. It's been talked about for several years. Companies have been either going on the journey or trying to start their journey around RPA, and internal audits played kind of two roles here. There's internal audit trying to figure out how they can use RPA or leverage RPA for what internal audit does. And then there's internal audits, what I consider the bigger role and the real value to the organization. And that is putting on the consultant hat and helping the business processes understand how they might be able to leverage RPA. And what are the things that the business needs to think about? And what do we need to be concerned about from a risk perspective? How do we help management make sure that as they take this RPA journey, that we're appropriately managing the risk that comes along for the ride? Because quite frankly, it's not just as simple as taking an existing control and automating that control and turning it into a bot. There are new risks that actually get introduced to the environment that we haven't had to deal with before because of this new automation that we're introducing to the environment. And some of the things that that we think about from an internal audit perspective on how can we from a consultant facing perspective support the business? What are the things that we should be thinking about and talking with the business about? Most importantly, they're establishing governance, right? So how do we know we have a good governance structure in place to really take this journey? Do we already have a good process in place to really take a look at where our opportunities are out in the business to automate certain controls? And how do we know that we have all the right people, all the right ownership, and all the right controls in place to make sure that we do that appropriately? The operating model. This is a big area where I think a lot of processes fail because we don't really think about what it really looks like across the business. I've been involved in a lot of situations, both on the industry side and on the consulting side, where management has said, "Hey, RPA, let's just go do RPA," and then all of a sudden people just start going and doing it, and it gets assigned to some people who management thinks has the skill set or knows what they're doing or knows enough to be dangerous, and then these things start to happening in little pockets across the organization with no real strategic look on where does it make most sense, where's the most value across the organization to start this, and where should we be investing our dollars, and how do we make a process scalable so that as we start to realize the benefits and we get more buy-in across the organization, we have a model that works across the organization, we can just lay across the organization and start to roll this out. Obviously, tweaks will be needed, but I think we see right now we're predominantly working in an environment where there's a lot of little pockets and people who are just being thrown at this because somebody in senior management or a board went to a conference and heard about this RPA thing, and now they want to bring it into the company. And there's not a lot of strategic thought put behind it right now. They're just going after it because every other company's doing it, so everybody's trying to catch up. And aligning priorities kind of goes along with that. How are we identifying what we really want to do? What's the value? What's the end game here? What are we trying to achieve so that we can make sure that we're going after the right areas to really build and invest this automation around. Gartner came out with some recent research that I found very interesting, where they said through 2021, 40% of enterprisers who are RPA buyers will have buyer's remorse, typically because they haven't really established these first three areas that we just talked about, right? So they're just going 100 miles an hour, they're slamming in automation where they think they need it, and then they're not really realizing the ROI on the backside of that, or really how to scale that across the organization. And so then the flame fizzles out a little bit, right? So it's really important here. I think internal audit has a really, really important role here, where we can really assist the business from a consulting standpoint. And so let me just pause there right there, because I know Renee has a little bit of experience here. Within Office Depot, his organization has taken on this initiative. Renee, you want to talk a little bit about a couple of those things, and how you, from an internal audit perspective, kind of view this from a business and how you can support the business?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Dave. So I guess one of the, to your point, one of the areas where we can add a lot of value for RPA is actually helping the business to address those key challenges that you had in the prior slide, that pertain to governance and operating model. So something that we realized at Office Depot, because I guess we were lucky that there were some visionaries in the finance team, and back in 2016 they started entertaining RPA. And also we had a lot of financial operational functions that were outsourced, very manual, very transactional. They said, well, why don't we start exploring RPA? That it sounds like a promising and can bring a lot of benefits. So, they started early, and, they took the time to do an assessment of what was the tool they wanted to use. So they went through a whole process. And 2 years ago, we realized that, they were ready to launch the first pilot. And at that time, they said, why don't we start discussing with them? And they said, why don't we have a project, an audit, like an advisory project? Because we see a lot of challenges. And it's interesting, Dave, that slide captures pretty well what they were explaining to us. We need to make sure we have the right roles or responsibilities, that we identify the key stakeholders. Is this something that is driven by finance? Is this something that should be driven by IT? So all those questions, and back and forth with governance. So that's how we realized that we could add a lot of value. We had an advisory project around RPA, and it was very successful. I would say at that point of time, they had started with three bots. It was the pilot. And I think that they have done so well. Right now, they have over 80 bots, and they have expanded across different functional areas. That's something that we can help them to look into, because they wanted to establish like a center of excellence for RPA. So one of the key challenges is that, well, you need to have the right governance and the right people sit on the table. If you want to expand, your bots, not just for finance operations, but also you want to do it in marketing. In our case, we want to do it in the retail stores, or you want to do it on B2B. So that's also something part of that governance. So I would say that, we were successful working with the business as far as, starting the model for RPA and trying to do the right thing from the very beginning.
That's great. Wow. Yeah. And just, it just highlights how important, instead of jumping right into developing RPA, taking a step back and really defining the ownership and the governance process, how important that really is. Folks, really quick, if I could mention, we see some questions coming in. If you have any questions for us, you'll see at the bottom of your Zoom window, there's a Q&A button. Please feel free to click on that, submit a question to us. We are going to get to those questions. We're going to save the last 10 minutes of this session, and we will address any questions that come in at that time. So, please feel free to submit anything. Thank you. So that takes us to a really big question, and that's where to automate, right? And so, as we just talked about, there's a lot of companies who have started down this journey already, some doing it very well, some very haphazardly, right? Kind of just picking on where they think RPA makes sense. But what's interesting is when we look at that list, you can see here where a lot of companies over the last year or two have really focused their efforts on where it is to automate in some of their processes. Interestingly, internal audit's not on that list. And so the question is, why not, right? And I think what we're seeing a lot in the market here is, again, from an opportunity standpoint, there's a plethora of opportunity out in the business process, because we're really looking at control processes that are good candidates to really put some automation around. What internal audit does a lot doesn't necessarily lend itself to building all of this RPA capability inside of the internal audit function. Yes, there's opportunity, continuous auditing opportunity, and other things that internal audit can use bots for to go out and get and do from a pure internal audit perspective. But the focus here really is in the industry right now is how do we look at these processes that are running our business and the controls that are embedded in them and automate them and change what the humans do around that stuff. And so when you look at a lot of these lists of where organizations are really automating, you're not going to see internal audit on that list a lot. Now, Eduardo has a lot of experience here. He's got his hands in the market all over this stuff, helping companies build this. Eduardo, what's your perspective on this and why you don't necessarily see internal audit on this list?
Yeah, so we see that, of course, 70% of organizations start with finance and accounting. Naturally, it's a transactional based, there's a lot of transactions happening that are repetitive in nature. And that's one of the key differentiators to try to find a process that can be automated. You want to have something that is being done day in and day out in the exact same way. I'm not going to say that it needs to be only one way. It's not just automating the happy path. You're going to be automating a lot of the exceptions and changes, but you want to have it to be high volume and repetitive in nature. You're going to see processes within internal audit, such as the extraction of sample data and doing preliminary analysis on that data that can be automated. The thing is that it's not repetitive in nature. So you're not doing that every single week. You're not doing that every single day. So with that, it gets pushed down in the priority list. And that's what we're seeing. There are processes that can be automated within the internal audit function. But again, there are so many other processes within the organization that is being done every single day by a significant number of people that it naturally gets pushed down in the priority list to the second, third year of an automation program.
Great, thank you, Eduardo. So there's a lot going on out there, and I think there's a lot of opportunity for growth. I think we're still learning a lot, right? And I think we learn, I think as you know, even as consultants, we're learning from the standpoint of how companies are looking at RPA and how they're using RPA and how we can come in and help people think about, you know, these things like governance and scalable processes as well. So we've talked a lot about what is IA's role here in this intelligent automation and RPA role here. We've talked about the consulting services, and we'll get into a little bit here about assurance services as well. So we've had a lot of dialogue around how can internal audit help the business think about this. And we're going to talk a lot more about that here shortly when we get into a little panel discussion. But let's talk about the insurance piece of it as well. So as these processes get established, as RPA processes and automation processes get established throughout our processes all across the business, and it becomes more of a material issue, if you will, because more and more controls are getting touched. Internal audit also plays a vital role in helping, you know, to provide management some assurance that the controls and the supporting processes around those automated controls are working effectively. You know, they're not only designed effectively, but they're operating effectively as well. Because we'll talk a little bit of, well, actually we'll talk a lot when we get into the panel discussion around some of the significant risks that come along for the ride in implementing RPA and new risks and new worries that get introduced into an organization. And so from an internal audit perspective, as they get built and we're consulting with the business, how can we come back on the back end and provide some assurance that those processes are being followed and they're designed appropriately and they're all working to make sure that these automated controls don't get out of control some way. Some of the risk can come from there. So Renee, I know you've had some experience here. Would you like to share with the audience, you know, some of the things that you guys have done, you know, there at Office Depot around this as well?
Yep, definitely. So, you know, specifically on the 3 lines of defense, if we start with the first one, I mean, that's what we were discussing before, right? You know, from the very beginning, we were partnering with the business, make sure that they had the, you know, the right governance and controls in place. I mean, those controls start not only IT controls, but also business process controls. I mean, you will need to have those to ensure that, you know, the success of your program. So that's definitely, you know, a key area for audit to focus on. Also with second line of defense, I mean, there is a lot of opportunity. We haven't, I would say, implemented a lot of in that area, but I can tell you that recently we've been having a lot of discussions for information security as they also implement more tools and automation. So for instance, Splunk. I mean, there is a lot of things being done with Splunk. And so we're having a lot of discussions about how we could use that to do some automation and help, you know, the their groups to increase compliance across the company. And on the third line of defense, I think Eduardo was right, spot on. For us, we've been looking at what is repetitive in our department. So since 2 years ago, we start challenging ourselves in internal audit, saying, okay, where can we implement RPA? And funny enough, to Eduardo's point, when you look at the list of priorities for what you want to implement in your company, the benefits that you will get from applications within audit probably wouldn't match the ROI in other business areas. So that's one of the reasons, you wouldn't probably will get into the top priorities. However, we kind of took it up on ourselves, and we found other tools, not the same tool. Like for instance, in the company we use Blue Prism, but to do some automation. So for instance, around SOX, and exactly to Eduardo's point, we use it to extract data or samples from our ERP. So because that's so repetitive and we need those samples from our GL all the time, that's something that we have automated. So that's working pretty well. So those are the areas where we have been, using RPA in our department.
Great, great. So I think we're going to actually head into our second poll question here. And that is, what role do you see internal audit playing in 2021 in your RPA efforts? Give everybody a few seconds to answer that question. And then I'll turn it over to Renee and Eduardo to talk about some of the significant risks that they see out there associated with RPA.
Sure, yeah. So definitely, I mean, I would say that I would probably categorize those risk areas in some buckets. I mean, one of the key areas we talked about was around governance. And I think that that's one of the, the key priorities. Make sure that there is a right objectives, right strategy, right roles and responsibilities. That's something that we saw when we work with the business, that was an area they were struggling. And we're glad that, we had those discussions and they were looking for some guidance as far as what would be the right governance around those areas. The other piece I would say more related to IT, SDLC, system development life cycle. I mean, those processes are very critical. As you're going to be using IT and, to implement all this automation, I mean, it's very important to have good change management and software development practices in place. Same thing with IT controls around security, ITGCs. That's very important to ensure that, that your platform is stable and has adequate controls. And I guess the last bucket I would say is on the operational side, business, making sure that there is adequate controls around business process, disruption to handle that. So having adequate business continuity planning or disaster recovery plan, that's very critical, especially as you start scaling up and implementing more bots and automating more tasks. I mean, that's very critical in the case of an outage or failure. I mean, if you don't have adequate BCPs, DRPs, that could be, a major issue for your organization.
I agree with Renee. And I agree with Renee. I think that the main risk that you're going to find is that as organizations, if you have one project, if you have one bot and you took it as a pet project, yeah, the risks are minimal. But once you start to scale this and it's all over your organization and you are getting hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars in benefit every single year, that also comes with the fact that you significantly reduce the staff that is working with this processes. So what happens if your bots fail? What happens if your bots applications change are no longer able to provide that? You need to have the adequate, SLAs and support team to engage on those processes and be able to restore, have your business continuity plan, potentially have, staffing services that can actually ramp up and be able to do that while the automations are redeployed. But those are kind of the main risks that you're going to find on your RPA program. This is why internal audit having a role on organizing RPA as it scales is so critical in order to be able to ensure that those are in place, and also gauging the level of risk that comes with some automations. There are some automations, hey, something breaks, I can be without it for 2 weeks, no issues. I'll just, pick it back up before the end of the month and I'm going to be fine. There are automations that can really harm somebody's business if it breaks. So there's an array and there's a dial on how risky automations can be. So internal audit being part of that, I think it's critical.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys. So I guess the theme here is there's a lot to think about, right? There's a lot of there's a lot of existing risk, there's a lot of new risk, and there might be some specific risk in certain organizations, depending on how a process runs, that might be unique to another organization that we might not even be able to cover just in a general overview of all the things to think about from risk, right? So it's really important for internal audit to kind of bring their skill set to the table with management to help management route out all of the risk that could be introduced or kind of showing themselves as you're building this automation in your business. And just as an example here on where bots can be used and how internal audit can really help here. And it may be obvious, it may not be so obvious, like here within the segregation of duties areas, right? And so in today's world, we try to control this through how we design our roles, how we provision those roles, and who's reviewing and approving, and also some back-end testing. We have rule set testing and all of these things that we do. If you're a public organization, there's the Sarbanes-Oxley world that's always looking at this as well too, right? Well, how can bots help us here? Well, we can automate some of the tasks in real time, right? And so as we're provisioning roles, the bots can be looking across all the other roles that people have in real time, instead of manually forcing some of the rule sets, like inside of a tool like SAP or inside of Oracle, where sometimes you have to manually hit the buttons to force that stuff. These bots can automate that and be running that all the time. It can also be scouring the system for when anybody changes a configuration in a role and lets you know right away, right? It says, hey, something changed here. I need you to know about this right away. Whereas in today's world, a lot of companies, what they do, they're running monthly or quarterly reports, and somebody manually is trying to go through there, and we know what happens there. Things get missed. Sometimes the reports don't always run on time. Where these bots are, like, they're working day and night. They never get tired, right? So we're significantly reducing the risk of missing something by taking a good control that we already have and making it better by building this automation around it. So, just as a quick example to throw in there. So you guys can obviously probably figure out the recommendations we would make as we kind of, talk through what are the risks, what are the things that organizations have to think about. Obviously, we're heavily focused on getting that governance framework. Make sure there's a strong governance framework, there's strong ownership, there's real definitions around how the people are playing in there, and what's our strategy, right? Build that operating model. Make sure the operating model makes sense for the organization and not just for one little piece of the organization, so that you can easily scale as you see the value and more management gets you get more management buy-in on this. And really, from an investment standpoint, prioritization. That initial upfront analysis on where the most value is in the organization, because not only are you going to get the most ROI for that, you're probably going to get the most buy-in when people see that it works, because it's going to be a high-profile area, right? And so those are really good reasons to try to go after those areas right there. So I think with that, we're going to move into our third polling question, and that is, how would you describe the maturity of your RPA governance program? Give everybody a few seconds to answer that. And then I'll turn it over to Larry, who's going to lead us into our panel discussion.
Thanks, Dave. So we've touched on the journey as we go through an RPA process. We've touched on the processes that go ahead and get RPA'd, if you will, some that do, some that don't, what internal audits roll in. And so what I'd like to ask Eduardo, and then we'll jump to Renee, is as we talk about what's a successful RPA implementation and what's an unsuccessful RPA implementation, Eduardo, can you share with us a little bit about the role of governance? Does internal audit get involved, or do they not get involved, and maybe that's why the program failed? Share with us some more stories, if you will.
Yeah, so it's interesting going back to the comment and the quote that we got from Gartner that 40% of organizations are going to feel buyer's remorse, because we're definitely seeing that. You don't know how many companies just start the RPA journey by making it a pet project. Somebody takes it on because they love the technology, they start with it, and then you start seeing a lot of the mistakes that lead to that, from not having a clear vision, to not having the right resources, to not having the right controls or governance to maintain and provide long-term value to those robots. And we're seeing that the main reasons why organizations fail start with, the vision. An organization basically cannot scale if it doesn't have buy-in and understanding, but that comes from adoption. In order to achieve adoption, you need to have trusting the technology, and not by saying that UiPath or Blue Prism automation anywhere work, because I think that's something that is I think that is something that is already proven, is doing the right level of implementation by having a team that is seasoned and understands how to build these bots correctly, not only to just do the work that they're supposed to be doing, it's just to provide long-term value. And this is where I think internal audit can play a great role, is by making sure that these robots provide the necessary monitoring, alerts, and provide the necessary visibility so that a team can actually provide support and maintain those bots working day in and day out. When an organization builds a bot and then that bot misses transactions or gets stuck all the time, or you have something that is it looks like a black box and I don't know what it's supposed to be doing, the organization will naturally revert to doing it manually, with the expectation that you're going to get the savings. Naturally, you get the headcount, the FTEs cut from your department, but you're also expected to do all the work. So that's where RPA goes to fail, and I believe that the 40% of buyer's remorse comes from specifically that. And I think the internal audit has a great role of making sure that the process of deploying it is correct, that there is a code review and a support team that is ready to receive that and be able to provide the value to the organization going forward, and also have the right controls and accesses to all the applications so that there is no super users being created out there, so that the bot can do everything that I wanted on accounts payable for I know organizations have made that mistake. Hoping that.
Thanks, Eduardo. Renee, you're, in terms of the role that internal audit and you have played both on an advisory and an audit perspective, seems to be a very important success factor in the way the bots have gone from, I think you said you're up to 80 bots now?
Yep, 80 plus.
80 plus. But one thing that you're doing, which I don't think a lot of internal audit departments are doing, is I think you are using RPA as part of a control monitoring mechanism.
Yeah, so
can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So we, as I mentioned before, internally, we haven't gone through the Blue Prism route, but we also have challenged ourselves to, put in place some automation. So some of the things that we did first was finding those repetitive tasks within audit. SOX is one of those. And then within SOX, also looking at what are those controls, things that we always test and very manual and repetitive. So we were able to, using a tool that allow us to do some automation for the work paper. So basically, when we do testing for access reviews, we repeat exactly the same steps for a bunch of systems. So we realize, hey, if we can automate this, that will help us big time. So we use a tool, it's called Microscheduler, to do some automation and using, our Excel templates for the work papers. But actually that went pretty good, because that allow us to take all the inputs, the files that we needed, the HR list, system user list, and all the inputs, put it to this robot, and basically that created the work paper, your pivot tables, everything. So it did all of that. So that's one of the things that we did. Also with SOD, we implemented some automation where on a weekly basis, we are helping business to identify SOD issues on the business side. So we're getting feeds from the ERP, our Oracle EBS, and then we have program all the different rules to identify the SODs, and that's another piece that also we're doing. I guess the other piece that I would highlight, Laurie, is that, and to Eduardo's point, I think that the value that we bring to the table and audit, we always want to be advisors. We want to add a lot of value to the business. And I think that I would say that we have added value to the business three ways. One is when we start early looking at providing advice on governance, on controls, making sure that you have the right framework, the right controls, that's a lot of value. So that's one. Second, in the company also, we got to the point that we have bots in the finance area that are executing some SOX controls. So we have audited those SOX, that automation, because that has to pass for the SOX, requirements. So we also audit those bots, and we audited for SOX. So we added the ITGCs, and also we audit them as an application control. So we do that as well. And I would say the third one, which we haven't talked about, but this is very interesting. If you think about audit, we are looking at all the areas in a company. When we do our audits, we might be doing an audit in finance and one in operations, once, in the supply chain.
Yeah.
And something we have done is in a couple of our audit reports, we have mentioned that it's important for the business to consider automation. So at least I recall 2 audit reports where we found very highly manual processes. And it was like, like an army of people doing the same thing, and management, they were feeling the pressure and they're trying to do the right thing. And then we brought this idea, and then we made the connection between the business and the RPA teams. And now we're pleasantly surprised to see that RPA is expanding in some of those business areas, because we found the opportunity. We saw that there was issues with control and processes, and that if they would have used automation, that would have saved a lot of time, and they would have have better controls and better processes.
Dave, did you want to add anything to this from what you're given your experience and past as a CA as well?
Yeah, and I can tell you. So my days as a CAE, this was our RPA was kind of a new buzzword, right? And I have to tell you, to be honest, like when I first encountered the RPA world, I was kind of like, well, how is this different than what internal audit does today with tools like ACL and IDEA, where we run data analysis? And boy, did I get an education, right? It's very different, and it's taking that to another level, but also really turning on the human aspect, putting the human aspect on steroids, if you will, when it comes to control operation, right? And because again, the bot never gets tired, the bot never stops, right? And so the opportunity to scale that across the organization is what I started to look at and say, okay, how can where's my high value control targets? Where's the biggest risk in the organization that's going to get management's attention? Because I'm not going to get management's attention unless I speak to them about the risk that they really care about. Once I get their attention and I show them, I was able to show them, look, I can bring these experts in that know this stuff, and we have some folks in our own IT organization that know this a little bit, get them working together. And now all of a sudden I can take this control and I can automate this. Now this person is not spending all their time trying to find issues. They're spending all their time fixing the issues, because the bot is finding all this stuff. And it's also doing some analysis. There was a little bit of now this may be a little more advanced for what we're talking about today, but one thing I started exploring was how do I make the bot a little smarter, right? And that's when we start to get into this thing called intelligent automation, right? And how do I, cognitive computing, but how do we make this thing start looking in other areas that the traditional control doesn't look in, to start associate, right? And that's kind of maturing it a little bit. But as I was putting my thinking cap on in the organization, I was looking into the future, which I suggest everybody do here, because it's not just about taking a manual control today or some other control in the system and putting more automation around it and asking you to do a few different things. That should lead you to another cognitive state in your own mind. What's the next step of this? And what's the next value that we can bring to the organization? And how can we really start to route out finding things that management should care about? Because at the end of the day, it's about making ultimately what we deliver to our customers the best possible product it can be. Mm-hmm. And so if we always keep that customer in mind, we're always going to be thinking about how can I take this automation and how can I keep progressing it? It's not a one and done thing, right? We always want to keep looking to make this stuff better. And this technology, quite frankly, is moving faster than any of us. The RPA I put in today, 3 months from now, is going to be even made better by this cognitive piece that's being built onto it, and even just better technologies and better ways to actually automate some of these controls. This is moving so quickly, which is why it's so important. And I always say, look at the big risk in the organization. What is management going to listen to? And then make sure that you're bringing your internal audit expertise to the table for the business, because they're not going to be thinking about governance. They're going to be thinking about what's this going to cost and how much am I going to save and what's my payback going to be. You have to be the person guiding them to say, well, wait a minute, we got to crawl before we walk and we got to walk before we run. Let's get our processes in place to make sure we do this correctly.
Yeah,
the change management piece and all of that.
Yeah, and when you touched on it, Eduardo touched on it briefly, talking about APIs out to whether it was Microsoft or AWS, kind of more of whether it's the voice analytics and recognition, image capture, and AI components, which we were talking about this yesterday. And from a risk perspective, my immediate thought is you're passing information to third parties It could be PI, it could be PHI. So internal audit needs to be part of that dialogue and make sure those third-party risks, which we know are one of the most significant risks across all organizations today, are touched on. So I think we probably are at a good inflection point to take some questions from the attendees. And so, Dave, I think you have access to some of those. We've got about
I do.
5 minutes
yeah.
left. So why don't we jump into that?
Yeah, a question that always gets asked here, and I know how to answer these. I'm gonna actually ask Eduardo to step in here a little bit and talk about. So we have a question: how much does it usually cost to establish an effective RPA environment, and what is the ROI?
Yeah.
It's a broad question, but I know Eduardo, you answer that a lot. So
Yeah. So of course this is I've done I've done automations that get paid before the end of the month, and I've done automations that get paid in about 18 months. It's some of them, it depends on the complexity. To automate a process, it takes a certain amount of time and effort. It doesn't matter if it's being done every single day or if it's done once a year. So you're going to see implementation costs go anywhere, at least in our world, anywhere from $20,000 to $80,000. It depends on how many exceptions, how many variations of the process, how many applications is the robot going to have to interact with. Is the source data structured or unstructured? So there's a lot of different variations and things that need to be taken into consideration. Regarding, so there's two components: the professional services or effort being spent on building it, which I just mentioned, and then we talk about, what is the licensing going to look like? And that will heavily depend on how do you want to build it. This can be done on premise, on cloud, private or public cloud. This can, it can be organized and orchestrated. So the way that robots work, they're not just a license, that are sitting in somebody's laptop. It can be as simple as that. That is called a attended robot. Those are very inexpensive. You're looking anywhere between $1,000 and $2,000 a year for that license. That license has the same capabilities of any other bot. You just got to trigger it. It's not going to automatically start itself. And then you have the unattended world of automation, whereas robots are running on schedules, on triggers. There's no human interaction whatsoever. It's basically running on the cloud or on premise on a server. Nobody takes a look at it. There's no screen needed. That's where real automation happens. Depending on how you want to build that, it's going to vary your licensing cost, but it can go anywhere from $18,000 a year, $20,000 a year to $40,000 to begin with, depending if you want to host it at all, or you're okay with, let's say, UiPath hosting the licensing for you. So that's kind of a good range to say, but I would say that the usual payback of a process should be around 12 months or less if you're doing with the right skill set, and if you're doing it with the right procedures and I guess governance. Because one of the biggest things that we were mentioning is that governance starts with from the moment of selecting a process to go to be automated all the way through. I'm going to continue to provide the service forever. Is 2 years from now, how does this automation look, and who is providing support for it? So I think that those are major things that people overlook and ends up being more expensive depending on who you choose to do it and which technology you choose to do it with. I'm hoping.
All right, thank you, Eduardo. That was no, great stuff. Thank you, Eduardo. Next question I'm going to throw over to Renee. We have a question that says, as an internal audit function, how do you navigate remaining independent? We have automated a number of control tests, but are looking to expand to working with the business to automate the controls themselves where possible.
Yeah, that's a great question. We actually went through that already, and we were working with management, and this discussion we were having, and also we have to involve our external auditors. But I would answer it this way. I would say that I will look at RPA as continuous control monitoring. As you see how continuous control monitoring works, the idea is that audit has the expertise on design, like what would be an effective controls, but we don't get into the business of designing controls. And basically sometimes when we are helping management to say, okay, we do an audit, let's say for travel and expense, we do an audit, we know what are the things we look at, and we build a dashboard or we build some analytics about it. What we do is we said, okay, management, this is what we have built. You can use it to monitor your continuously your controls. So same thing with RPA. So for instance, the example I use for SOD, that's something that we have to go through this, and we have to work with external auditors, because it's the question like, okay, so what is audit doing about these controls? Do we have an independence issue here? And I guess what is key is that audit is not designing any of the controls. We actually have some of the tools that help with this automation and the scripting, but we're not designing any of the controls. And when we talk to the external auditors, we have to have meetings and discussions about how this was being done. I mean, that was the key thing, and they were good with that. The fact that we are not designing any controls is really management who's designing the controls. Of course, we as internal audit, we can advise to have a better control. If we see opportunities to say, well, you want to maybe consider this, or this is a best practice for the design of the control. But at the end, it's really management who's designing and signing off on those controls. And then if we help, I mean, we can help with maybe if we have the tools and maybe the scripting, like for instance, in our case, we have different tools like, Highbone or ACL. We can help with that, with the implementation. But of course, there is going to be certain considerations. So for instance, if we're using a tool like Highbone or something like that, we need to have ITGCs, and those needs to be, like audited and all of that. So that's other considerations. But again, I think the key is that audit shouldn't be designing control for the business.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you, Renee. So what we're going to do here is we have one more polling question here we're going to throw out, and we're going to quickly talk about a couple. Actually, Larry's going to share with us a couple of upcoming webinars. One of them will actually answer a question that somebody asked around, is there guidance on how to audit RPA? So stay tuned for a minute.
Yeah, and so one of the things that we've talked and we've seen is there's a lot of discussion about RPA, where organizations are, what internal audit's role is. And so in January, we'll put on a session around how to audit RPA. But before that, in December, we also wanted to highlight that Auxis with Eduardo is going to talk about going into 2021, what does it take to get RPA right? We expect with the vaccines coming out of COVID, again, this kind of acceleration towards digitalization, and anything digitalization requires faster decision-making, better analytics of your data. And so RPA is a key pillar to a lot of organizations. So from an understanding of what it takes in an organization to really mature and get it right, so you can start to move into some of that intelligence automation. And then in January, we will talk about what you can do to audit RPA from an internal audit perspective. So with that, I think we're at 1 o'clock. I think we've taken the full hour, so we appreciate your time for attending. We're very happy to send you copies of our presentation. So we'll be, and there is some kind of key takeaways in our presentation. There's some links to some additional RPA resources that we're very happy to share. And we hope you found it useful, and look forward to seeing you join in the future. If you want CPE, we will be sending CPE certificates if you've answered our questions. We needed to get those poll questions in to qualify for CPE for those that do indeed want it. So I just want to extend a hearty and welcome thanks to Eduardo and to Renee for providing some very valuable insights into our panel. Dave, you as well. So on behalf of Focal Point, Dave, Casey, who's in the background, and everybody else, thanks a lot. Have a great holiday next week, and be safe. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.